25, something like that. There's Allison. Hey, Allison, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
You're just in the nick of time. I like that.
That's how I roll.
Good for you. Okay, welcome everybody. It's noon. We're starting and we're recording. Um, Welcome to the World Affairs Council Zoom program on Canada's national election, a pivotal moment for U.S.-Canadian relations. I'm Charles Shapiro, the President Emeritus of the World Affairs Council. This is the fourth installment in our Beyond Borders Zoom series. And today's topic is Canada's elections and what in the heck it means for Canada and for the United States. Ricky Bevington, who's the president of the World Affairs Council, is in Germany with the Council's International Fellows. So she's usually introduces the panelists. I get to do that today without Ricky here. Allison Gifford. Allison, wave your hand so everybody knows which one you are, besides your name being underneath your picture. Is the Vice President for Policy and Public Affairs at Clear Strategy, a consultancy with clients in Canada and the US. Allison spent the last 15 years working on or adjacent to Parliament Hill, providing strategic advice to political leaders, labor leaders, companies, important private sector companies, and nonprofits. And as we're about to hear, she's an expert in tech, trade, supply chain, logistics, transportation, labor, health, sustainability, and I bet a bunch of other stuff too. Allison, where are you right now? Are you physically
I'm in our
located?
nation's capital. I'm in Ottawa, and I'm right beside the Parliament buildings.
Okay, cool.
Parliament has not resumed yet, obviously, but in a few weeks.
Okay, so you're in your offices.
I'm in my office. Yep.
Good. Laura Dawson is Executive Director of the Future Borders Coalition, where she works with government and industry leaders to facilitate Canada-US cooperation on supply chains, travel, and digital technology. She's was named one of Canada's top 50 foreign policy influencers of 2024 by Hill Times, which is very cool. She's a technical advisor to the Canada-US Trade Council, and she is also my wife. So anybody in the audience who's got anything critical to say about Laura, keep it to yourself, okay? There you go. Laura, where are you located?
I am today in beautiful Brampton, Ontario, which, if anyone does not believe that Canada has an industrial heartland, I am dangerously close to it. I'm here talking to a big group of folks about tariffs on pharmaceuticals.
And Brampton is in Metro Toronto, right?
Yes, conveniently near the Toronto Pearson Airport.
Okay, cool. And both, if it's not clear to everybody, both Allison and Laura are very proud Canadians, right? And you look proud. So now to the audience, we're going to do questions from the audience. If you move your cursor down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little question mark that says Q&A. And that's where I want you to put your questions. I think the chat is disabled. Please put your questions there. The reason I like to use that is the font is larger and it's easier for me to read it as the moderator. So please use that function. I posted a question on LinkedIn in one of my pieces of advertising asking what electoral districts are called in Canada. Did anybody know? And Maya Lewis, who's a friend of our family, answered correctly. A Canadian electoral district, for reasons I do not understand, is called a riding. So we're going to be talking about ridings. And do either of you know why it's called a riding? Those degrees in political science did not focus on that. Okay, so here we go. First question. And this is, I think, Allison, I'm going to ask you first. You talk to loads of Americans. What is it we Americans, what should we understand about how Canadian elections work that we just don't get? I mean, we've got a presidential system, we've got a parliamentary system. They don't mesh perfectly. But what is it we don't understand that we ought to understand?
That's a great question. A couple of things. We don't vote for our prime minister. You guys vote for your president. Ours is kind of like, I don't know, I don't play poker, but in the movies, like whoever gets all the big chips kind of puts them in a pile and they're the winner. That's kind of our single member plurality system here. So the prime minister is chosen based on who has the most seats in the House of Commons. So that is one big difference. I don't like, is our SNP, like first past the post system, is that unique?
No,
No, not quite, eh?
no.
Okay, so we also have
Okay,
single member plurality.
yeah. Laura, you got anything you'd like to add? What do we not
Yeah.
understand about Canada?
Well, and so taking Allison's point a little bit farther, we don't have, compared to the US, a separation between the executive and the legislative. Our executive is the guy or girl who happens to be the most successful of the legislators. So we do have a judiciary, but we have a fused legislative and executive. And so that means that Canadian Parliament, Canadian legislature can move very efficiently, much more so than in the United States, especially if you have a majority, which we don't have right now. But with a majority, the prime minister and cabinet can just get stuff done in a way that would be the envy of the United States. But do we not have a system of checks and balances? Indeed, we do. And that's the provinces. The provinces have a disproportionately higher impact on what the federal government does. So they tend to slow things down, and there's a lot of horse trading that goes on with the provinces.
That's great. And in my experience, it seems like the provinces have got more power in Canada than the states have in the US.
Oh, yeah. And Charles Shapiro, do you know what the maximum amount is that you can contribute to to a candidate in a Canadian election?
$100?
No, you can contribute $1,750 to the candidate and $1,750 to the party for a grand total of about $100,000 per candidate. That's kind of the spending limit for Canadian federal candidates.
Okay, so Allison, you had elections on Monday. Lots of news articles that people have read or haven't read. What was the outcome? Just give us here's the nutshell. Here it is.
Yeah, for sure. So the outcome is that we ended up with a very, very large minority government. So you typically need 172 seats to be a majority government, and the Liberals, I understanding, I believe, as they continue to count, it went up from 168 on election date or post-election date. And I think it's around 169 right now, the number of seats that the Liberals have. The Conservatives have about 144. And so the Liberals don't have a full majority mandate, but they only need the support of about 3 MPs to advance their agenda. So they're going to have to, if they want to do something a bit more socially progressive, strike a deal with probably the NDP and get
Tell
their
us what
support.
NDP stands for. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, the New Democratic Party. So think of it as like if the Democrats split in half and one side got like Bernie and the unions and the other side kind of got like the Clintons. The Clinton side would be the Liberal Party and the New Democratic Party would be the Bernie and the union side. And so they'd have to make that kind of deal with the NDP. I mean, the Liberals did that quite a bit during the last government as well. They may have to show some favor to the Bloc Québécois. So that is something very interesting about Canadian politics, is that we actually have a sub-state nationalist party who runs in the federal election and represents the interests of one province. And sometimes it's a secessionist message, and sometimes it's just an interest-based bloc. So the government can work with them to get some support, or they can work with the Conservative Party, maybe on trade or economic issues or downsizing government. They may get some support from there. So they will have to work with others. I think
why wouldn't they form? Why wouldn't Prime Minister Carney make a deal now with one of these smaller parties, ensuring a majority for the duration of this parliament?
Because this has happened sort of in the past with the New Democratic Party, but it also spelled doom for the New Democratic Party. The New Democratic Party used to have 102 seats in the House of Commons. After this election, they have 7. And part of that is because the last government was incredibly unpopular and the NDP held them up for a while to pass legislation through. So the NDP during that process had brand dilution and weren't seen as a credible party with a national message as much as a boutique party that could, make deals with a real national party. And that really played out in voting behavior. So we'll see what happens to the NDP moving forward, but they lost party status. And as I said, they've gone from as high as 102 to pretty much one of their lowest counts in recent history at 7.
Okay, you lost me there. What does losing party status mean?
So if you have fewer than 12 seats, you don't have official party status in Canada. So it really does put the NDP on the fringe. They have less resources. They have less time in government, less in question period. They have less representation in committees. So, they're in the penalty box for this government for sure. And I think one of the interesting things about Canadian politics that has changed since the last last modern rounds of elections is that we really, at this time, have a two-party system. And what was interesting about the Conservatives was that they had actually over 40% of the popular vote. And that's formed majority governments in the past, depending on voter efficiency. They got a number of votes. 144 seats in the House of Commons is the largest opposition we've ever had in history. But because the other parties' support collapsed, the NDP, the Bloc Québécois went down 10 seats. They used to steal votes away from the Conservatives and the Liberals. And as a result, there was never this kind of concentration of two parties. But we're very much seeing that now. We're looking a lot more like a U.S. distribution of a two-party system.
So both of the major parties got more votes than they got in the last election and picked up seats at the expense of the smaller parties.
That's right. The Liberals went from 152 to about 169, and the Conservatives went from 120 to 144.
Laura, what surprised you about the results?
Oh, well, the biggest surprise, of
No, but Laura's frozen.
Up until and Pierre Poilievre were on track to win the election. That this election really became a referendum on who was the most, who was best equipped to take on Donald Trump and to manage the trade and tariff war, and also to take on the really aggressive 51st state stance that Donald Trump has been putting out. So really, Donald Trump gave this election to Mark Carney.
So the major issue in this election wasn't anything internal to Canada, but Donald Trump and his approach, his policy towards Canada over the past 100 days.
It wasn't the only thing, but it was certainly definitive.
If you
Allison,
look at
what surprised you?
Well, yeah, if you look at the graph of Carney's support, the Liberals were down here and the Conservatives were up here. And the day that the tariffs came in, the Liberals went way up. And that was because Mark Carney was the former governor of the Bank of Canada. For those of us who were following politics or worked in politics at the time in 2008, he was credited by all parties, by the Conservative Prime Minister, by the Liberal and NDP opposition. They would always use him as like a reference point for how Canada was weathering the storm of the recession. And so that made him pretty untouchable by a lot of political stripes, because he was sort of known as this steady hand during the recession. So when you think about someone to deal with Donald Trump, one of the problems that we had in Canada was our previous prime minister sometimes enjoyed pushing the president a little bit too far. And we kind of saw that as not helpful to us, because we ended up being on his radar more than we cared to be. And so I do think that Canadians wanted an economic manager, somebody with not as much flair as perhaps Justin Trudeau had, and a little bit more restraint. And so I think all of those things together made Carney very popular. And I think the other thing that's interesting in Canada is in our last session of Parliament, it was very, very polarized. And so there was a lot of slogans, very, maybe like kind of what we saw coming out of the US, sometimes slogans instead of policy would come out. And I think all of the parties were very guilty of this. The NDP had this big class war, eat the rich message, which we don't really have a ton of billionaires in Canada, so it sort of fell flat. Trudeau was, known for his virtue signaling, and Pierre Poilievre had a lot of slogans, but when you looked at the slogans, they didn't always line up with the economic policy. And we were eating that up until Trump won and up until we got the tariffs. And it was very interesting to see Canada change so quickly in terms of how responsive we were to that sort of sloganeering and to that manipulation of the electorate. It became something we were fine with until we weren't.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a question for the audience, and you may want to, send me an email or put it in the queue. I mean, I don't understand why Trump threatened Canada. It seems like that a better outcome from the perspective of Donald Trump and the Republican Party in the United States would have been for the Conservatives to win the election in Canada. And for him to have done what he did, as you just stated, Allison, gave a huge shot in the arm to the Liberals and to Mark Carney. Laura, how if Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives picked up seats in Parliament, how did he lose his own riding?
Well, politics are about so many things, and it's about how you're feeling about yourself, but it's also how you're feeling about the guy. Pierre Poilievre, God bless him, I'm sure his wife and child love him very much, but he was never a really lovable guy in politics. He came right out of school as a political advisor. He's been, a loyal conservative all the way up, and it was sort of like, okay, I've worked my way up to this position. I should be prime minister because I've been around long enough. But Mark Carney was just a much more likable person. And I think when there's a crisis in affecting a community, people elect a guy who's like their dad. They looked for the dad who could manage this this bully from the South who knew a lot about economics, and Poilievre just didn't tick those boxes. But one of the things that I will probably get to our questioning later is that the Poilievre or many of the Carney votes were a bit reluctant because you're still getting the same old economic gang. I mean, he's yet to name a cabinet, but people were tired of the way that the Liberals were managing the economy, and it was sort of it was a peacetime economy when you had money to spend and you had an opportunity to not focus on trade competitiveness, not focus on cutting spending, deregulation, etc. So people are concerned about what they're going to get from this new or from the new and improved Liberal government. And there's a lot, I think, of Western disaffection and alienation, because if you look at that map of who voted Conservative, it is very, very strong in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and those folks were just waiting for a change, waiting for someone who would take energy and fossil fuels seriously.
I mean, the Conservatives, and pardon me, the Liberals didn't win a single riding in Alberta. I mean, what's behind that? What does that show?
Allison?
History. They don't typically have a history of having like cleaning up in Alberta. They usually only get a few seats. And I think that the Liberals, dating back to Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who is Justin Trudeau's father, have always had a bit of a stance that, and I think that this progressed with Justin Trudeau of, yes, very pro-environment, very, green transition. But what actually happened during Trudeau's 10 years in power was that we weren't very successful at the green transition because we weren't very successful at meaningful industrial policy. And so we never really got there. But at the same time, I think there was a lot of shame being thrown at Alberta for being this oil and gas producing province. And sometimes in a way that was pretty inappropriate, because it is also a huge economic engine of the Canadian economy. And it's so easy for other provinces like Quebec, who relies much more on hydroelectric, to pretend like they don't drive cars and that, they don't reap the rewards of this particular resource heavy province. And so I think it's a lot of frustration that's been building up for decades. But Laura, I will let you jump in on that one, because I'm probably missing pieces of the pie.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was raised in Alberta. I went to high school in Alberta, and you just, you know, a liberal was like seeing a unicorn. It's like, really? You're a liberal? That's very brave. There are more liberals in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and there are certainly people who are very much committed to environment and sustainability. But there's also a recognition that, you know, Western Canadian interests, Western Canadian economics have not gotten the attention of Ottawa. And that's where you hear the moves towards, you know, Western separation and Alberta secession coming up. And that is also why there's not much support for Donald Trump's 51st state. It's, you know, fewer than 10% last time I looked in Canada. But where you'll find that support, it's going to be in Alberta, in those disaffected regions.
Okay, Allison, in the United States, we have this 10-week transition between the election and the inauguration of the president. In Canada, you have a 0-day transition between the election and the winner taking over as prime minister. What does Carney have to do in the next 30 days?
That's a great question. So you're right. There's not a huge transition in that he's already the incumbent prime minister. So he already has a bare bones prime minister's office, and he doesn't need to be sworn in. But what he does need to do is select a new cabinet. He doesn't have to, but typically a new prime minister with a new mandate will select a new cabinet. And he's going to want to do this because the cabinet that he put in place before he won this election had to be drawn from from the Trudeau government, essentially. So he is going to very much want to show that he is not Justin Trudeau. You'll notice, we noticed that during the campaign, Carney was very careful not to say Trudeau's name. And as a result, he's also going to want a cabinet that has fresh faces in it. He is much more to the center. He is an economic focused prime minister. And so he's going to want to bring in some of his people into cabinet. So we have some dates that are going to influence that. So Canada's hosting the next G7, and the G7 finance ministers meeting is going to be in Alberta starting on May the 20th. So if you look at the clock, he's got 20 days to get a finance minister in place. And then the House resumes right now on May the 26th, unless he calls it back sooner. So in the next 2 weeks, he is going to be putting together his cabinet. He's going to be putting together those cabinet ministers' mandates based on the platform. And he's going to be thinking about what he can execute now and what he's going to need to execute when the House rises. So things that he can do now, he can do diplomacy right now. He can get projects going in terms of setting up working groups, panels. He can start looking into housing and figuring out how to address housing issues. What he can't do is spend new money right now. And he cannot legislate really. So what he's going to want to do is have a plan for those legislative pieces when the House comes back, but also show Canadians right now that he's dealing with the cost of living. We too have been hit by inflation as well. And it's been food prices are high. All the prices are high right now combined, even before the tariffs. So he's going to want to show action. And then the House should resume around May the 26th. It should be operational only until June the 20th. So in that time, he is going to need to give a throne speech, which will set out sort of the high objectives of his government.
Did you say a throne speech?
A throne speech. It's very old school. So the government writes it, the Governor General reads it, but it's essentially laying out what this government intends to accomplish in the next session, which will be a 20-day session unless it's extended. I would imagine it'll be focused on middle-class tax cut, which was something that was important to both the Liberals and the Conservatives during their campaign. And then the other piece will be legislation to remove any federal impediments to interprovincial trade, which was sort of an area of weakness for the Canadian economy vis-a-vis the US, where we had this very integrated relationship, but we were losing a lot of productivity by not being able to trade provinces not being able to trade with each other. And the best example I'll give you is I remember talking to an American wine importer who was talking about the tariffs on French wine. And I laughed and I said, well, I can't even get wine from another province. And she said, what do you mean? And I said, well, I can't buy BC wine because of interprovincial trade rules. Like, we just need to really get on it. So those are the things he'll be looking at. And then the other thing he'll be doing before the House rises is passing a federal budget, because we need new money to be approved.
And if I can jump on that too, it speaks to the precariousness of the Canadian parliamentary system. Remember, I said it was so efficient and they can get things done very quickly, but the government can dissolve very quickly. And the thing that would dissolve it would be the failure of a prime minister to pass a budget, or the failure of any bill that was related to money supply. And so if they can't pass that, that's considered to be a vote of no confidence. And that could collapse the government, and that could lead to yet another election so that a party can get the confidence of the electorate.
Yeah, typically the lifespan of a minority government is 18 months.
So it's not a set 5-year term. It's
no. It's, I mean, if nobody does anything, they last for 4 years. But you don't want to go too soon. Well, for one thing, the leader of the opposition lost his seat. And the leader of the New Democratic Party resigned. So those parties are going to want to recalibrate anyway. And you want to get your coffers, back up to where they were pre-election. So there are some of and you don't want to annoy Canadians. If you go back too fast, then people hate you. So I would say 18 months.
Wow.
Yep.
That's pretty amazing. So Laura, I'm going to ask you this. You've talked about tariffs, both of you. What's the status of tariffs? I mean, I'm confused. That the United States has put this tariff on, taken that tariff on, added another. What is tariffed of stuff, Canadian products entering the United States and U.S. products entering Canada? The short version, not the encyclopedic version.
You may not know this, Charles, but Allison is and Clear Strategy, they're a member of my Future Borders Coalition, and once a month we do a status of tariffs call. And you know who gives the status of tariffs update?
Allison.
It's actually Allison. I will say it's just a sort of intro statement that the status of tariffs is not great. It's not great for anyone. Canada was an early target for these tariffs with the IEEPA tariffs, which are tied to a security emergency in the United States and tied to the flow of fentanyl and unauthorized migrants across the northern and southern border. So that was, he got in early with that, and then he was like trying out all sorts of other tariffs on Canada. And then the whole world was implicated, including islands without penguins. But the thing that has changed a little bit is I feel like Canada's been moved to a little bit of an island with Mexico. We have a bit of a, in the eye of the hurricane, the USMCA or CUSMA states are actually being set aside and given a little less attention right now. But that's my 30,000-foot approach. I'm going to throw it back to Allison because she's tracking this stuff every single day.
Allison?
I am. So the IEEPA tariffs, which we also over here call the border and fentanyl tariffs, those were the first round of tariffs. I believe early February, those came into place. So that was originally 25% across the board on all goods except for energy. And it was 10% on energy. That has been backtracked a little bit. So now it's 25% on all goods except for USMCA or CUSMA, as we call it here, eligible goods. And non-CUSMA USMCA qualifying potash rate would be reduced to 10%. The second round of tariffs we received was steel and aluminum, which that one can really affect our supply chains over here, because as you know, I mean, if I've got Coca-Cola on the call, for example, you know that you produce for economies of scale, and a lot of those pieces of steel and aluminum are imported to Canada. And so I just know Coca-Cola's in headquarters in Atlanta. That's why I'm picking on you. But anyway, those that's a 25% tariff. and that is applicable to all global imports, including Canada's. So that one stays in place, and that one is not reduced in any way. That one's just still in place, and so that one still is an issue here in Canada. Then we also have all non-US origin automobiles imported into the US have a 25% tariff. However, it isn't as bad as we originally thought when it came down, because only 25% tariff only applies to the value of non-US content. So there is a lot of US content in our vehicle manufacturing, and as you know, parts move across the border many times. So it isn't as stark as just a 25% tariff across the board. It's only on non-US content. And I think that the big three here in Canada had sort of seen that as a bit of a reprieve. And then the big bang that we were all waiting for was the reciprocal tariffs day. And so that's the one where we were ready to, our initial response to the tariffs was to put forward about $30 billion worth of retaliatory tariffs from Canada. And that came following the IEEPA, or the border fentanyl tariffs. And it wasn't across the board like in the United States. We targeted based on what can we produce here in Canada, and what that we don't need to import, what can we get from other trading partners, and what products like bourbon, for example, are a huge industry in the United States that we consume, but we won't die if we're without it. We'll just drink crappy Canadian Club for a while. And go
I'm
from
assuming
there.
Canadian Club is not one of your clients.
No. But my husband drinks enough Canadian Club for our entire family, so I'm not too worried there. We're still patrons. But so we were waiting for that big bang, and we had another, oh gosh, like I think we were going to get ourselves up to about 125 billion in retaliatory. So we were waiting on a good chunk, maybe 85 billion to slap back on the United States. But because we weren't part of those retaliatory tariffs, it was just the Penguin Islands and Cambodia, then we did not retaliate substantially, so or at all on the reciprocal tariff. So we're sort of in a holding pattern here. And what Mark Carney has said very clearly, both in his platform, publicly, he's been very consistent on this. We will only act if we need to respond to an additional US round of tariffs. There's nothing coming from us otherwise. And we have done, because our economies are so integrated, we also have a remission process here. And what that basically means is if you can make a case for why your manufacturing operations might have to close down and you'd have to relocate, or if jobs would be lost because of our reciprocal tariffs, then we can carve that out, because it's a huge issue in our supply chains. They are just so integrated.
And let me jump on that for a second, Charles, on the economic impact. I think it's important for a US audience to understand that 78% of Canadian exports go to the United States. Something like a third of GDP is dependent on that trade relationship. 22% of those exports is deeply discounted Alberta oil that goes to Texas, that is then refined and sold at a profit to domestic customers and to foreign buyers. Canada is much more trade vulnerable than the United States. And so what they're estimating...
So that's the leverage that President Trump is talking about, is since a much greater percentage of your trade exports go to the United States than US exports go to Canada, that's where the leverage resides.
Yeah, and they're estimating that the trade war and retaliation can have up to a 3.5% increasing reduction on Canadian GDP, something like 700,000 jobs lost, extraordinary impact on increased prices and affordability. It is not just a minor blip for Canada. It is existentially damaging to the Canadian economy, and that's why Canadians are responding so with such shock and surprise.
So, I mean, this is for both of you. Mr. Carney talked in his victory speech and all throughout his campaign about essentially decoupling the Canadian and US economies. Is that, in light of what you just said, is that feasible at all? Can you really do that?
I mean, I'm happy to take a stab at that. my response would pretty much be no. At least not in any short amount of time, not in 1 or 2 or 3 years. It would be something that would have to happen over significant time. And the amount of time that would take could possibly be longer than President Trump's tenure. So, I think we have to be very careful about that. There's no easier trading partner than the United States. It's been our best trading partner for so long. Nothing has to travel by ship. It's pretty much turnkey. There's a certain amount of regulatory harmony. And so I think it would be very, very hard to decouple ourselves, particularly in areas of very, very integrated manufacturing. So yeah, no, not in the short term. However, this government, just like the Trudeau government during Trump's first administration, when we dealt with tariffs as well, was to look at trade diversification. So that definitely will be a priority. It was a priority 10 years ago. And then, when the tariff threat went away, I think we just got comfortable again. So a few things that Prime Minister Carney is committed to, which will ultimately be good either way, is to invest in trade infrastructure. So he's looking at this trade diversification corridors fund, which would be about $5 billion to upgrade our ports, our railways, our airports, our highways, all of that trade enabling infrastructure. And that's going to be important to the Canadian economy either way. And then looking at interprovincial trade, labor mobility, so that we have a more productive Canadian domestic economy. And then I think also we will look at leveraging our trade agreements with other partners a bit more. I think there was a time where we had more trade agreements than any other G7 country. I don't know if we still wear that title, but we have signed a ton of trade agreements. What Canadians are not great at is actually using them as exporters, because we have such a cozy, comfortable relationship with the United States, that adding trading partners where goods have to travel by ship, or where regulations are significantly different, I think that will need to be taken more seriously, but it's also something that's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah, on decoupling. Oh, sorry. Did you want me to
I
answer?
was going to ask you a question. So yeah, I want this ties into it. So the president, the prime minister offices announced that they're going to meet soon, right? And at the latest, in what did you say, 20 days at the G7 meeting in, where is it, in Quebec province? Laura, if you were writing the talking points for the prime minister, right? What would you say? I mean, how do you have that first conversation with President Trump?
Yeah. I think that the economic reality, geography is reality. Canada is very, very tied up with the United States, and to lose that US market will be really very economically painful for Canada. And I don't see any way to, unless the US continues down the road of sort of barricading itself as the hermit kingdom and tariffs against everything, and we produce everything domestically, in which case Canada's hand is forced. Canada's going to have to find a pragmatic way to work with the United States and work with Donald Trump. We know that the first thing that President Trump wants really is for Canada to up its spending on security and defense. Right now in the Canadian Arctic, the US spends 5 times more than Canada does for the defense of the Arctic region. Canada needs to get above 1%. Well, it needs to get to 3%, but right now it's at about 1% of GDP
When you're
on
of
security
GDP.
spending.
Let me just
Of GDP on security spending. So they need to get up to that level. So that would be the first thing. The second thing then is finding pragmatic ways to work together on the things that the president's executive orders have actually identified as areas that the U.S. wants to reduce economic dependency on China and other places for strategically sensitive and important things like critical minerals, like chips, like medical supplies and vaccines. And these are all things that Canada can work with the U.S. on. So there's a pragmatic approach that I hope the Prime Minister will take, but Canadians are just so angry. And would be much, it would be more in keeping with the mood of the people to say, we don't want anything to do with you. We're going to go off and play our own game. But that, to me, is not an economically sensible way to go. So it's going to involve finding a way to work with the guy, even though he has demonstrated time and time again that he's a difficult and relatively unreliable trading partner.
I have a few things to add, if I may.
Yeah, please.
Because
and,
I think
and then we're going to go to questions from the audience. So audience members, please, I've got 4 of them now, but so please submit your questions while Allison adds a few things here.
Sure. So I think it's really easy for Canadians to feel like 100% victim in all of this, but there are some things that I think we have to be humble about going into these conversations. I think that we got so caught up in our own domestic politics pre-President Trump that we felt that we could, that the trade irritants that we were producing made more sense than maybe diplomacy with the United States all the time. And by that, I mean, we were not contributing to security and defense. That was an issue. We were told many times. We were told by the Biden administration too. The other thing is the DST. We were told by the Biden administration to not do it.
But nobody, please explain what DST is.
Digital sales tax. Sorry. We have one very similar to France, and Biden had asked us to wait for the OECD to have a global model, and we went ahead with it anyway. And then we also have, as I mentioned, like a very, very strong Quebec faction in Canada. And in order to keep national unity, we tend to have these trade policies that tax the import of cultural products, or Netflix, etc., because we don't want them to overly compete with the Quebec culture industry. We also do that with dairy, because dairy we have a supply managed dairy system here in Canada, and that is very much tied regionally to Quebec and to Quebec votes. And since it is a very vote-rich province, we tend to make policies that appease domestic realities and not always trade realities. And so from all of that, I think you can see that like the Trump administration doesn't like the taxes. I'm sure they let us keep our cultural protection, but it's the taxation that seems to have been an issue. And I do think that we have to go in somewhat thoughtfully and have that conversation about taxation and what's fair and what's not fair, because we tend to be a little bit preoccupied with our domestic politics, and also just a bit slow in terms of creating value in our own economy. So we're rich with critical minerals, yes, but it takes us 15 years to get them out of the ground. And those kind of industrial policy pieces Canada has been slipping on. And so, we do need to get serious. And I think that this is a bit of a wake-up call, but just keep those things in mind. I mean, we think we're perfect and we're super nice, but like, those are some things we should be self-aware of too.
So there are real issues.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Here, Carrie Bass asks the following: is the concept of a North American regional alliance dead?
Can jump on that one. So in 1994, made a big bet on NAFTA and aligned our economies and reduced trade barriers, had a common system for dispute settlement. And it really, businesses responded to that, and there were a lot of important trilateral supply chains created. They're not necessarily visible to the naked eye because a lot of them are Canada, US, Mexico. The Canada-Mexico component is sometimes less easy to see, but on a regional basis, we have become a very successful, robust trading region. But we are each sovereign states, and so it becomes quite difficult when you get to the point of a North American community and having common political structures and institutions. People have been very reluctant to take that next step. And so unlike the EU, which has a common enforcement mechanism and common governance, the North American community does not. And so it was vulnerable to that, vulnerable to a lack of consensus about how to upgrade the agreement, etc. And then it was sort of the straw man. People blamed the rise of China and trade with China on the NAFTA. So it had a real branding and PR problem. From a Canadian perspective, it's if we're going to save this thing, it's extremely important to have Mexico on board. Canada-Mexico relations have really been up and down. There was a recent, some recent regrettable criticisms made by Canada of Mexico. And Canada, I think, needs all the allies it can get in managing the 100-pound gorilla that is the United States. And so Canada and Mexico, I think, have some fences to mend, have some joint strategy to work out. And of course, we have to remember that Mexico has a much stronger legislative lobby in Washington than Canada does. So there's a lot more in the a lot more folks in the U.S. Southwest who are very oriented to Mexico-U.S. supply chains, but also vulnerability related to security and crime. So it just gets a lot more airspace in Washington compared to Canada, which is the nice hat on top of the United States that doesn't really do much to gather ire or concern usually in Washington.
Steve Leeds asks, and I'm going to direct this to you, Allison, what role do the provinces play in implementing Prime Minister Carney's responses to Trump and the tariffs? Did they have a role at all, or is it all federal government?
No, they have a huge role. And I think we really were able to see that because our prime minister sort of resigned right before this trade escalation began. And we were going into an election campaign. So there was a bit of a leadership vacuum federally during that time. And the provinces, which we call the Council of the Federation, were meeting weekly to advise the prime minister. Provinces tend to be, the premiers tend to, of course, represent their constituencies, and they can have a very rocky relationship sometimes. As we've mentioned, Alberta is the one to pay all the bills, but kind of not to get much in return. And Quebec has a very, very strong sub-state nationalist bloc as well. And so there are times where provinces, can't move past their own interests, but when it becomes an issue like this, a bit of a national interest situation, they do tend to work together fairly well. Provinces can affect trade negotiations in a few ways. I mean, I think we saw this with the de minimis in the United States. There's an 800.
You're going to have to explain what de minimis is.
Okay. Oh, yeah. So the amount that you can import duty and tax free. So in the United States, you can import up to 800 duty and tax free. We were originally around $20 tax free and $40 duty free. I might be getting those mixed up. But anyway, the moral of my story here is that we could not achieve reciprocity because the provinces did not want to lose any more public revenue. So we only got it up to about, I don't know, what was it? It's 75 and 150, something along those lines. Anyway, not super high. And then I think there's also industries that are indigenous to certain provinces. And so that's why you see our dairy industry so protected, because it's attached to a province. And when it's an energy issue, of course, it's attached to Alberta. So it's a family. It's a family, that's for sure.
Okay, good. Doug Franklin asks the following, and it's about Greenland. And that is, how does Canada look and the Carney government, how will they look at the Trump interest in somehow the Greenland becoming part of the United States, since Canada actually borders Greenland and I think you share an island or something somewhere, right? Is that an issue? Is it a salient issue for Canadians and for the Canadian government?
Well, it's a salient issue in that Canada and Greenland are both Panama, I guess, in the Gulf of Mexico, but on the initial firing line of Trump's territorial expansionary campaign. And at first it was like, oh, he's just saying that. He's trying to liken himself to President McKinley, just puffing himself up. But when the comments were continual, and then you've got really, I would say, more overt overtly avaricious behavior towards Greenland and sending J.D. Vance over there and, measuring the place for drapes, that then begins to smack of not just idle talk, but military invasion. And that is very, very, shocking and surprising for Canadians. And I think they feel very, very like-minded and supportive of Greenland. And also keep in mind too that Greenland has a very large Indigenous population. And I think that that is a perspective that Canada can very much relate to as it struggles with its own reconciliation with Indigenous persons in this country.
Okay, a new question just came in. Let me see. We've got time for one. There's some Maddie Cook, who's an American living in Atlanta, who was a trade commissioner for the Consulate General of Canada in the U.S. In Atlanta, asks, what happens to the Trade Commissioner Service? Does its role change? What happens to that program in a Carney administration?
I can jump on that, and then Allison might have some ideas. So the Trade Commissioner Service is like the equivalent of the U.S. Commercial Service, where folks are posted abroad or they hire local people like Maddie to help promote trade and investment. So to talk to folks in Atlanta and say, hey, you ought to consider a business relationship with Canada. You ought to consider investing in our high tech or forestry sector, win-win on both sides. So they are the great salesmen. The problem, of course, is that they are not equipped to deal with misinformation and push back on major policy issues. And also, if Canada is serious about trade diversification and not playing a role in the U.S. economy, do we get rid of the trade commissioners entirely? I would like to see an expanded role for the consulates in the United States, Canadian consulates in the United States, to really grapple both with the sales and marketing end of the relationship, but also the policy and countering misinformation and being a much stronger presence for Canadians in the United States, because they haven't been particularly good at that. And if you read the Hill Times, you're not reading the Hill Times today, you're in the United States, but there's a story in the Hill Times about that very issue today, which is a Canadian newspaper, which you should subscribe to.
Which I should subscribe to. Okay,
Yeah.
Allison, the last audience question. And that is, if the U.S.-Canada trade relationship, this is from Ash Miller, does not improve drastically over the next year, will President Trump move to dismantle USMCA CUSMA during the review period, which I think is scheduled for next year, 2026, in favor of a bilateral agreement, which he seems to prefer? So what happens at the review session in 2026, Allison?
I don't want to get in the business of predicting what President Trump is going to choose to do or not choose to do, but I think the review's already started, to be honest. I think those dialogues have already begun. And it's been, it's been reported in our media following Carney and Trump's last call that, our prime minister is open to some sort of Canada-US economic vision or partnership or cooperation. So those things have been socialized with Canadians. And I think the Prime Minister Carney has also socialized with Canadians that, yeah, we might have to renegotiate either USMCA or a bilateral agreement. I think there would be support on the Canadian side if there was a sense that this would create stability again. In terms of the Mexico piece, that's a bit I'm no diplomat. I'm what we call applied. So I don't know about the Mexico piece, but I do think that Canadians are open. Like, if we have to renegotiate this, fine. Let's just move on. Let's have some stability.
Okay, so here's my final question that I've been asking at each one of these, and that is, Laura first, and then Allison, what's your favorite bar in Canada?
Oh my goodness. Oh, so many. Favorite bar in Canada? Oh, okay, I got it. I have a history of dive bars. I worked in many fine beer halls in British Columbia and the interior of BC and spent some of my misspent youth there. But I would have to say that my very, very favorite bar in Canada, and it's time specific, is the Chateau Lafayette in Ottawa on Saturday afternoon to watch Lucky Ron and
Yeah.
Sweet Suzanne. And if you've never seen Lucky Ron, you have to, well, there's a little bit of Stompin' Tom Connors, if you know who he is, a Johnny Cash-like guy. He does the same show every single week. Ottawans come in and they know all the words to all the songs and all the games he plays. And Lucky Ron is truly a Canadian icon. He actually performed at my son's wedding. And that's where I would be on a Saturday afternoon in Ottawa at the Laugh, having a cheap, well, relatively cheap quart of beer.
The Chateau Lafayette Bar. Is that the name
Yep.
of it? Okay.
Yep. In the market.
It's no chateau though.
Okay. So
Lucky
Allison,
Ron, Lucky
what
Ron
can,
also, sorry, Lucky Ron also sang at my 40th birthday, I'll have you know.
Woohoo!
He's in my backyard,
Yeah.
and my husband gave him $100. So my favorite slash so this bar is not run by nice people at all. It's in Montreal. The beer is awful. They serve stale popcorn. It's called Biff Tex Saint Laurent, and it's on Saint Laurent Boulevard in Montreal. But it's like everything kind of hilarious and goofy about Montreal. It's just this grimy hole in the wall. And I worked there for a while because I also served a lot of beer in my youth. And one of the funniest moments I ever had at that bar was I had one table. And at this table was Melissa Oftermar, who was the bassist from Hole, had brought all of Hole, all of Smashing Pumpkins, and all of the Foo Fighters with her because they were traveling together, they were touring together. And she used to work at that bar, and her father used to be the mayor of Montreal. And so they were all there. And so I turned around and I looked at this table of music celebrities and really just focused on them for the rest of the night. And I'm pretty sure I got fired the next day, but it was worth it. So that's my favorite bar / my favorite bar story.
and repeat the name again.
It is Biff Tex Saint Laurent. Don't eat there, just drink beer.
Don't eat the Biff Tex. Okay, so Biff Tex Saint Laurent.
No
Okay,
Biff
well,
Tex there.
great. Well, thank you both for the tips on what bars to go to in Canada. I want to thank the audience. I encourage you all to join the World Affairs Council of Atlanta if you live in Atlanta. And if you don't, join the World Affairs Council in the city where you live. The next in-person program of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta is Friday, May 9th, with a half-day symposium on Europe. Go to the World Affairs Council website to find the registration link. Looks like it's going to be great. I will also give anybody on this Zoom a 10% discount on our next free Zoom if you could tell me what Canadians call mac and cheese. What Canadians call mac and cheese that we do not. I want to thank Dan Aboga, who's the producer of this Zoom. And above all, I want to give my really huge thanks to Allison Gifford and Laura Dawson. I promised you we would end in an hour, and you've spent a great hour with us. And to misquote, to paraphrase Allison, this has been an information-rich Zoom, right? She talked about a vote-rich province. This has been an information-rich Zoom. I've learned a lot. This has been terrific. And so I've written all this down. We're going to see how this plays out. The recording of this conversation we put on the World Affairs Council's YouTube channel this afternoon. And I'll send it to everybody who registered and the people who are on the call. And I encourage you to share it with all of your friends and colleagues. Thank you very much. It's been super informative and very useful and a lot of fun. Thanks, Allison. Thanks, Laura. And Laura, hurry home.
I will. And congratulations, Adrian and Maya Lewis, who got the answer to the mac and cheese question right.
Good for them. Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.